Hey everybody, so this is going to be the lecture for week 1 in Survey of Anatomy and Physiology. You'll see I have the transcript of the lecture pulled up. Make sure you read through the text as well as view either this transcript or the normal version of the weekly lecture. This video is purely to help elaborate on some of the concepts. So, few things to start off with. This first week is kind of introducing you to some of the most simple concepts that we have in anatomy and physiology. And to start off with that, we're going to talk about what anatomy and physiology actually is. So, you can think of anatomy as the structure itself, okay? And physiology is what the structure does, how it does that, okay? The lecturette gives you an example of the heart. So when you name the heart, that is an organ that is describing anatomy. You describe the way that the heart functions to produce blood flow. That is physiology, okay? So anatomy and physiology really do go together, all right? And you'll see this as we go through the class, but it really is, you can kind of describe it as form and function, okay? Where form is anatomy and function is physiology, all right? They really do complement each other, and in the case of the example given here in the lecture with the heart, just the way that the heart musculature is set up, the way that the valves within the heart work, and the electrical conduction system within the heart, all developed in a very specific way for blood flow to occur correctly through the body. Okay, and before we really start to dive into the specifics of things, we have to start at a sub microscopic level, at an anatomical level. So really, you can think of anatomy and physiology as being a branch of biology, right? Well, everything in biology is made up of chemical reactions, essentially. And those chemical reactions are determined by physics. Okay, so the basis of everything in anatomy and physiology always goes back to the anatomical level, and it always ends up coming back to physics, chemistry, and biochemistry. Okay, so to highlight here, everything we'll discuss stems from actions at the atom level. Okay, atoms will bond together. So what you actually see here is a molecule. So we have 3 atoms here. This molecule is actually going to be water, which you can see abbreviated as H2O. So the big red is an oxygen, and the 2 whites are a hydrogen. Okay, water will always look like this in molecular form, by the way. Always looks like that. Um, Molecules will then form together to create macromolecules. So we have 4 main macromolecules of life, and those are nucleic acids, fats, which are also called lipids, sugars or carbohydrates, and proteins. Okay, and proteins are made up of molecules of amino acids. So as those macromolecules get combined together, we end up with organelles. Okay, so you'll have organelles, which are parts of an individual cell. Okay, so a cell is the smallest fully functioning form of life, realistically. So organelles, they do specific jobs, but the organelle cannot function without other organelles assisting it. So in the case of mitochondria, and again we'll learn about these organelles in depth, but mitochondria are responsible for energy production, the primary form of energy production within the cell, and that that's going to utilize sugars and oxygen, right? So, but a mitochondria can't function without certain proteins. It can't function without certain enzymes, and those proteins, those enzymes are actually made by another organelle called a ribosome. And the ribosome is told how to make those things from the DNA that comes from the nucleus. Okay? And that's a really simplistic form, but we'll go into details as we move through the course how those processes kind of occur. So then next, when you have a bunch of cells that work together for one function, you end up with what's called a tissue. Okay? So you can have muscle tissue where all the muscle cells all have very similar function. They have very similar anatomy to them. Okay, they all look very similar. They all do very similar things. Different tissues will then form an organ. So this is going to show the stomach here, and the stomach is a good example of this, but I like to use the pancreas as an example because it's a little bit more extreme. The pancreas actually realistically has, 4 or more different, major cell and tissue types within it. Okay, there's cells that are responsible for the digestive function of the pancreas. There are cells that are part of the insulin production of the pancreas. There are cells that are part of the glucagon formation within the pancreas. Okay, and then there's other cells. Every organ is going to be made up of connective tissue. Some organs are going to have, smooth muscle within them. So you can see right there, a stomach is a good example because there's a little bit of everything within the stomach. And there's even cells that create the stomach acid, okay? So then organs all kind of can work together for one similar function. And that's how you end up with an organ system, which is typically how anatomy and physiology is often taught. So in this case, we see the digestive system outlined here. And again, this isn't the whole digestive system, but this is what most people would consider the digestive system. Whereas, believe it or not, the digestion actually starts in the mouth with both mechanical chewing and chemical processing through saliva. But anyway, with this being the main component of the digestive system, we see a lot of action in the stomach with the stomach acid. After food content leaves the stomach, it'll enter into a very specialized part of the small intestine, and that's where we see things like bile and gastric, other gastric items being pushed into the food, and it all helps break down specific parts of the food. Like bile is very good at breakdown of fat, okay? And that's why people that have had a gallbladder removal will actually have trouble digesting large quantities of fat. Now, when we combine a bunch of organ systems together, you end up with an organism, okay? Now, organ systems often work together. Believe it or not, we have a very large link between the nervous system and the digestive system. The digestive system can be slowed down, it can be sped up by the nervous system. And the same thing occurs, the cardiovascular system, the respiratory system. A lot of these systems interact. The cardiovascular system can't do its job without the respiratory system bringing oxygen into the body for the cardiac system to circulate that oxygen through the blood. So we go from atoms all the way up to an organism, okay? And that's a major concept to remember as we go through this course. Everything that happens really is happening down at this left side at the atomic level, where we're actually seeing atoms and molecules interact with each other. Next, the concept of homeostasis. So homeostasis really, if you've taken healthcare terminology, med terminology, course like that, you'll learn homeo is kind of a root for the same. It's so what we're saying with homeostasis is the body is going to stay in its same function. Okay, our body uses energy to maintain optimal an optimal environment for its function. Okay, and this includes things like temperature, pH of the blood, the amount of oxygen that the blood has. Everything within the body is influenced by homeostasis, and there are various ways that homeostasis is actually controlled. And it also allows the body to both quickly and strongly react to changing external conditions that affect the internal bodily conditions. All right, so next, we're going to start to talk about some of the ways that the body is broken down, the way that it can be classified, things of that nature. So when we look here, a big idea is the body cavities. Okay, so we're going to have a cranial cavity that is continuous with the vertebral canal. If you remember, the vertebral canal is going to have the spinal cord, it's going to have cerebrospinal fluid, and the cranial cavity is going to contain the brain, which connects to the spinal cord. Okay, those two really do go hand in hand. They really are connected. But on the other hand, we have the thoracic cavity, and then you have the abdominal cavity. They look like they're right on top of each other, right? Well, they are, but there's something that actually physically divides them, and that's called the diaphragm. The diaphragm is actually the main muscle of breathing. Okay, so and when we get to the respiratory system, you'll really see why the diaphragm is actually in a very important location for breathing. Then there's the abdominal cavity. Immediately below it, a lot of the main digestive organs, and then the pelvic cavity, which you'll see reproductive organs, some of the end stage digestive system, things of that nature. So those two can also be combined because they are technically one continuous space, and that can be called the abdominopelvic cavity. But you can also end up being more specific because there are potentially parts of anatomy within the body that will go between these two cavities. So sometimes you'll want to say, the descending colon in the abdominal cavity, or the descending colon at the pelvic cavity, things of that nature. And we can see here the thoracic cavity is broken up into 3 different cavities, and they really are separate. Okay, we have the right and left pleural cavities. So when you hear the term pleural, equate that to lung. All right, right and left lungs. So those cavities right there hold the right and the left lung, and they really are separated by what's called the pleura. There's, we'll discuss this more later on, but the pleura is just a lining of those cavities, and they're connected via various vasculature and like the bronchi. But other than that, they really are separate cavities. Okay, so if you were to dissect a person, there is genuinely layers of tissue between these cavities. Okay, right in the middle, though, we have what's called the mediastinum. Okay, the mediastinum is what separates out the 2 pleural cavities. The mediastinum on the bottom portion, and again, we'll actually cover some directional terms here later on, so I'll just say bottom for now, but that's where the heart is going to be located. Okay, it's going to be located within the mediastinum. We're also going to have what's called the great vessels of the heart also within the mediastinum. So you'll have the aorta, you'll have the superior and inferior vena cavas, and you'll have some other branches off the aorta that are all within this space. And then deep, so underneath those, if we're heading towards the spine, you'll have things like the trachea, the esophagus. You'll reach eventually the vertebrae. There's going to be various nerves, things of those natures that all go through the mediastinum also. But just remember that all three of these cavities are truly separated from each other via tissue planes. Next, we can talk about the abdominal pelvic region and its classifications, the way that you would describe locations on these. And there's two main ways. You can talk about quadrants and you can talk about regions. All right. So, easy way to break it down is to think about what's within each region. Okay. So, we're talking, if you're talking umbilical, where is that going to be? Well, that's literally right where your belly button is. All right. It's going to be called the umbilical for obvious reasons. Then we move from there. You got the right and the left lateral regions. Very simple. Lateral just means to the side. Okay. So they're left and right of the umbilical region. All right. Now the others that are left, they're going to make sense based on actually the anatomy that's present in the area. So if we go up to the epigastric region, epi is going to mean like upon, so we're saying kind of upon the gastric region. And what do we typically associate with the term gastric? That's going to be the stomach and various it's the upper digestive region around the stomach. Okay, so we're talking epigastric. It's upon the gastric region. So that's essentially right down the middle, right where the main portion of your stomach is, certain parts of the intestine, a big portion of the liver, the gallbladder is, depending where you look, it's within this region. Next, to the left and right of that, we have what's called the hypochondriac region. Okay, so we don't need to think about the term hypochondria, but think about what hypochondriac actually breaks down into. It's hypo, which is going to mean below, okay, and chondriac region. So chondriac or chondral, you can think of as a term that can be loosely used to describe ribs, can loosely be used to describe cartilage. Okay, so you see here, you see the ribs, you see the cartilage of the lower ribs here. So this really is saying below the ribs on the right and the left side. All right. Then we head to the bottom row. And this one, right in the middle, makes sense. It's the pubic region. Nobody should have any issues with that because, again, it's going to be named based off of a couple major things. You've got the pubis region. So there's the pubic symphysis, which is where the two parts of the two sides, I should say, of the hips actually connect. And there's other bony landmarks along the hip bones that are related to this name. Okay. Then we have the inguinal regions. So you can think of inguinal as kind of being the space leading to the groin. And actually through the inguinal region, there's actually an inguinal fold, an inguinal ligament. Okay. So that's a big reason that this is named for the inguinal region. And again, the quadrants, they should be pretty self-explanatory. They're just direction and if it's upper or lower. All right. Another big thing to notice, all right, anatomical position. So to make things simple, we should always think about what anatomical position is. And you see here in this picture, the woman is standing in what's called anatomical position, all right? Palms face forward. And that's a big thing that a lot of people don't realize, is that the palms have to be facing the front of the body, all right? That's not necessarily natural to how, if you were to stand normally, a lot of times your palms actually face towards the side. But that's not anatomical position, and the reason for that actually relates to embryology and the development of the fetus. So, if you could imagine the way that the limbs grow within the fetus, they're actually going to originally be growing in a direction to where the palms would be facing forward. Okay, our limbs do a bit of a rotation as they develop, but their initial development is essentially this anatomical position. And that will, being an anatomical position, one, establishes a baseline position to describe locations, and we'll be talking about some of the terms here in a second, and you can see them right now on the screen. But it also actually helps make sense what some of the anatomy actually is, especially when you're dealing with complex regions like the brachial plexus, which is a large mass of nervous tissue that comes from the spinal cord, lots of crisscrossing of nerves, things of that nature, and it goes to the upper limbs, okay? It actually lays out in a way that you can literally see and make sense of when you're in anatomical position, because again, that was the way that the body initially started to develop. From the shoulder out, it developed in basically our anatomical position. Next, directional terms. So a lot of these can be used both as absolutes and they can be used as relative terms. Okay, so we'll begin front and back. All right, you would refer to front as anterior. It can also sometimes be called ventral, and we typically see ventral used in very specific locations, like the spinal. When we're looking at vertebrae in the spinal column, you typically see the front of the vertebrae, where the big, large, the body of the vertebrae is, the big bony, round type part is typically described as ventral. And the spine, or the part you can actually feel on yourself, on your back, is typically described as dorsal. Sometimes the back of the hand is called the dorsal aspect of the hand, things of that nature, okay? These, for the most part, though, can be used interchangeably. Next is superior and inferior. So you'll see a upper and lower component. Superior is above, inferior is below, okay? And like I said before, these terms can be used both relatively and absolutely. So if I say the head is superior to the leg, that's true. I can also say the eyes are superior to the mouth, right? Because they are still above, even though the eyes and nose are absolutely superior to a lot of the other components of the body. We'll also refer to right and left. So right and left will actually be the individual that the patient in this case. So you'll need to remember and quickly figure out, left versus right is going to be the opposite of what it is for you. Next, there is a medial and a lateral. So you can see the blue line drawn down the middle of the individual. Medial is going to mean closer to that blue line, whereas lateral is going to mean further away from that blue line. So it also doesn't mean that it has to be at the blue line, okay? So in this case, I could say the thumb is lateral to the pinky finger, right? To digit number 5. So that's correct. I can also say that in this case, the left leg is medial to the right arm. Okay? So if we're looking at this picture here, the leg is closer to the midline than the arm, all right? Typically, though, you wouldn't use medial and lateral to describe anything on opposite sides of the body, but sometimes, we have organs that cross the midline. So you could be comparing different parts of organs based on, where they are in reference to the midline. Next, another thing that can be kind of confusing is proximal versus distal. So you'll see here the arrows. It looks like they're going the same way as superior and inferior, right? Well, they are, but we need to keep the midline in reference here. So an easy way to think about this is if you hold your arm straight out from your body to the side, okay? Your shoulder is going to be proximal and your hand is going to be distal, okay? So it's a comparison of how far a part of the body is from the midline in comparison to another, all right? There's also going to be some other terms that we learn throughout. We'll talk about body planes as well. So you can have, there's 3 main body planes, and we can have them use them to describe the location of various parts of anatomy, okay? And we'll cover these more later on, but for example, the coronal plane would be a line straight down the woman here, okay? And the coronal plane is going to separate the body into an anterior and a posterior component, all right? Transverse plane, it'll come across at the center of mass, and the transverse plane is going to separate the body into a superior and inferior component, okay? We can also have bodily planes that aren't exactly coronal. They're not exactly transverse. So you can do a transverse cross-section up at the shoulder, okay? So a transverse cross-section is actually typically how you view something like an MRI, right? Next. So real quick, this is the components of Chapter 2. In Chapter 2, you're kind of introduced into some of the common molecules used by the body for various functions to maintain homeostasis. So remember, the basis for all action in the human body is molecular activity. It's at the atomic level between individual atoms and individual molecules. Okay. One quick thing to note, the pH scale in the body. Okay, so the pH is essentially a measure of acidity. Now, what it really is measuring is the hydrogen ion concentration. Okay, hydrogen ions on their own, H+, which you'll see down in this table here, is a crucial component of maintaining pH, and pH is incredibly important for homeostasis. All right. So generally for pH, 7 is considered neutral. If you're lower than 7, you're acidic. If you're higher than 7, you are basic. Okay. The body has various pHs all throughout it, but the blood, which is the main, transport system for material through the body, sits at about 7.35 to 7.4. Okay, and it has to be within that range. If it actually leaves outside of that range, we start to have different diseases related to that. You can have basic blood, you can have acidic blood, and they result in very different things. Okay, so remember, hydrogen ions, when they're in their H+, they're not bound to anything else, just the H+ ion is a big component of what pH is. And we have other things like bicarbonate, which is big. Bicarbonate kind of neutralizes hydrogen ions. Okay, so what kind of happens there is if you see the plus on the hydrogen ion labeling, H+, and you see that bicarbonate actually has a minus, the bicarbonate can actually take that that plus from the hydrogen, and that's going to reduce acidity and is actually a process that we use in the body via what's called a buffer. Another thing to note is that there are inorganic versus organic. Generally, what separates them is if they're used for bodily reactions specifically. Now, there are going to be inorganic molecules that are used in bodily reactions, right? Inorganic atoms, inorganic substances that actually are part of organic molecules. But if we think about it at a slightly higher level, organic substances generally you can think of as things that are necessary for sustaining life. And we'll also see molecules. Generally, molecules are multiple atoms bound together, and you don't see like the plus or minus on them. If you look at ions, those have charges, all right? You see the negative charges versus the positive charges, okay? So you can think of at, like we talked about earlier, the hydrogen versus the bicarbonate. Those two things actually do have they interact together. Okay, they'll trade their charges to become neutral. Okay, and that's going to lead closer to a pH of 7. Now, charges are also important to be kept in the case of like calcium, chloride, potassium, and sodium. Those are actually very important for their regular function within the human body and are part of their the reasons that they do what they do within the body. Okay, so that is it for the week 1 lecture.